It began with a knock that should not have been possible. 3 soft taps drifting through the quiet of Inspector Moreau's apartment on Rue du Parc Royal long after midnight, when decent souls slept and only the river fog kept vigil over Paris. The kerosene lamp on his desk flickered as though stirred by an unseen breath, casting uneasy shadows on the wallpaper and on the half-finished report lying before him. He had been alone for hours. Even Madame Moreau, with her gentle insistence that he rest, had long surrendered to sleep. Yet the knock came again, unmistakable and strangely hesitant, as if the visitor feared being heard by someone other than the man they sought. When Moreau opened the door, he found not a criminal fleeing into the night, nor a messenger from the Quai des Orfèvres with some urgent summons, but a woman whose face he recognized at once, despite the 20 years that had passed since he had last seen it. A woman he had believed dead, or at least vanished beyond the reach of any living memory. Her dress was damp with fog. Her gloved hands trembled, and her voice, when she finally spoke his name, bore the weary cadence of someone who had walked a long road of silence just to reach his door. What followed in that dimly lit hallway would unravel not only the fragile peace of Moreau's night, but the quiet certainties he had built his life upon. And as we retrace his steps through cafes where secrets brew stronger than the coffee, down alleys that remember too much, and across the shadowed banks of the Seine, stay with us. Share this journey. Lend your presence to the unfolding mystery, and if the world of Inspector Moreau draws you in, consider subscribing so the next case finds you as surely as this one found him. The knock came so softly that Inspector Henri Moreau first mistook it for the wooden settling of the old apartment building beneath the winter damp. He had been sitting alone at his desk for hours, the kerosene lamp burning low and casting a weak circle of amber light upon the scattered reports from the Quai des Orfèvres. Outside, the fog drifted in thick coils along Rue du Parc Royal, muffling the sounds of distant carriages and turning the gas lamps into smudged halos. Midnight had passed unnoticed. Even Madame Moreau, who had pleaded with him earlier to finish his work in the morning, had long since retired to their bedroom. Moreau had remained at the desk out of habit rather than necessity, lingering over details that refused to find coherence, letting the faint smell of ink and paper steady his thoughts. So when the knock came a second time, gently but unmistakably, it slid through the quiet like an intruder and pulled him abruptly back to the present. He rose slowly, uncertain whether the late hour or the solitude made him imagine things. Another knock followed, the same tender insistence, as if the visitor feared waking a neighbor more than disturbing him. The hallway beyond his apartment was usually silent after dusk, the kind of silence that seemed woven into the very plaster of those old Parisian buildings. He opened the door halfway, prepared to find a stray lodger from upstairs or a messenger from headquarters bearing unwelcome news. Instead, the fog spilled into the corridor like a living thing, trailing around the silhouette of a woman who stood motionless on the landing. For an instant he saw only her outline, a slender shape veiled in the grey mist, her gloved hands clasped at her waist, her head slightly bowed as if unsure whether she had truly reached the right door. When she lifted her gaze to meet his, the years folded in on themselves. Moreau felt something shift inside him, a weight he had carried for decades without acknowledging. Claire Rousseau. The name passed through his mind with the same fragile clarity as her face, a face he had once known well during his earliest months as a provincial inspector in Saint-Malo-sur-Seine. She had not changed as much as time might have dictated. She remained delicate-featured, with eyes that held both defiance and exhaustion, though now her skin seemed paler, as if the fog outside had seeped into her very being. She parted her lips as though to speak, but hesitated, and Moreau saw the tremor in her breath as it escaped into the cold night air. "May I come in, Henri?" Her voice was softer than he remembered, burdened with a hoarseness that suggested long days of silence or perhaps too many swallowed fears. She addressed him with the familiarity of another life, one he had closed the door on long ago. He stepped aside without answering, guided by instinct rather than reason. She crossed the threshold cautiously, trailing a faint scent of damp wool and distant railway stations. The fog clung to the hem of her coat, releasing droplets onto the wooden floor as she entered the narrow sitting room. Moreau shut the door behind her, feeling the soft thud resonate through his chest. He watched her move toward the lamp, holding out her hands to its meager warmth. The light illuminated her features more fully, the slight bruise of fatigue beneath her eyes, the set of her mouth that suggested discipline holding back collapse. She seemed smaller within the confines of the apartment, as though diminished by whatever journey had led her to him in the dead of night. Moreau remained standing a few steps away, unsure whether to offer her a seat or demand an explanation. Claire's sudden reappearance, after 20 years of silence, had shaken something he believed long settled at the bottom of his conscience. "You look as though you've seen a ghost," she murmured without meeting his eyes. Moreau swallowed, the dryness in his throat unexpected. "I might say the same of you." For a moment, neither spoke. The lamp flickered, struggling against the draught that slipped through the shutters, and he wondered whether the building itself recognized her presence, remembering along with him all that had once gone unresolved. Claire finally lowered herself into the chair beside the window, the motion deliberate, as if her limbs carried memories of flight. She placed her gloves neatly on her lap and let her gaze wander across the small apartment, lingering on the bookshelves, the framed sketches by Madame Moreau, the mantel clock that had belonged to his father. A faint smile touched the corner of her lips, not of amusement, but of weary recognition. "You've made a life here," she said quietly. "A respectable one." "And you?" Moreau asked before he could temper the question. "Where have you been all these years?" She did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her coat and withdrew a folded handkerchief, brushing it lightly over her forehead as though chasing away a headache. The gesture reminded him of the day she vanished from Saint-Malo-sur-Seine, leaving behind rumors that rippled through the town like a tide pulling secrets to the surface. No body had ever been found. Some claimed she had run off with a traveling salesman. Others whispered she had fallen victim to a crime too shameful for the authorities to expose. Moreau, young and inexperienced then, had been assigned to the investigation, piecing together clues from reluctant witnesses and evasive testimonies. The case had been closed quickly, too quickly, and the town had breathed a collective sigh of relief, eager to restore its facade of quiet respectability, but Moreau had never forgotten the unease that clung to the conclusions they had accepted. Claire exhaled slowly, the sound a fragile sigh. "I shouldn't have come. I told myself I would never involve you again, but something has changed. Something I cannot outrun this time." Her fingers tightened around the handkerchief, twisting the fabric as though it were a lifeline. He pulled a chair closer, the legs scraping faintly against the floor. He sat facing her, leaning forward with a calm he did not entirely feel. "Tell me what's happened." Claire lifted her eyes to his, and he saw the conflict there, a mixture of fear, guilt, and the strange resignation of someone who has walked too far to turn back. "I saw him, Henri," she whispered, "here in Paris, 2 nights ago." "Who?" She hesitated, as if speaking the name might summon the man himself. "Etienne Valin." Moreau felt the name like a cold draught. Valin had been a figure of suspicion in the old investigation, a man whose polite manner masked an unsettling charm. He had disappeared shortly after Claire, dissolved into the world like smoke from a blown-out lamp. The authorities had assumed he drowned or fled abroad, and the matter had been allowed to fade. "That's impossible," Moreau murmured. "He's been gone for decades." "He's here," she insisted, her voice trembling. "I saw him standing at the corner of Boulevard Richelieu, watching me. The same coat, the same faint smile, as if no time had passed." A chill crawled up Moreau's spine. He tried to reconcile her certainty with logic, but the memory of Valin's inscrutable face flickered through his mind. If Claire was right, then the past had not simply returned. It had been waiting. "What does he want?" Moreau asked, though the question tasted futile. Claire lowered her gaze to the floorboards. "I don't know, but he followed me from the station. He wants something he believes I still have." She paused, breathing unevenly. "And I cannot face him alone." Outside, a carriage rolled past, its wheels slicing through the damp silence. The sound felt impossibly distant, as though the world beyond Moreau's apartment had shifted into another realm while the two of them remained trapped in the heavy air of memory. "Why come to me?" he asked softly. She looked up again, and for the first time he saw the depth of her vulnerability, raw and unguarded. "Because you were the only one who ever believed something was wrong, even when everyone else chose the easier truth." The words settled between them, stirring old emotions Moreau had suppressed under the weight of marriage, duty, and the passing years. He rubbed his temple. The lamp's glow reflected faintly in his wedding band. "If Valin is truly in Paris, we must be careful. We cannot assume his intentions are harmless." Claire nodded slowly. "I didn't come for forgiveness, Henri. Only for help." He felt a heaviness expanding within him, not unwelcome, but undeniable. The arrival of Claire Rousseau had cracked open a part of his past he had long considered sealed. Now, with the fog clinging to the windows and her presence anchoring him to a case he had never truly solved, Moreau understood that the night marked the beginning of something far larger than her return. He stood and walked to the window, drawing aside the curtain. The street below lay empty, the gas lamp flickering beneath the swirling fog. For a moment, he imagined a figure watching from the shadows, waiting for Claire to emerge. He let the curtain fall back into place. "We will face this," he said quietly. "But not tonight. You need rest, and I need to think." Claire rose slowly, exhaustion etched into her movements. Moreau watched her, sensing that sleep would bring no comfort, only deeper echoes of whatever had driven her to his door. The fog pressed against the glass like a silent witness. The room felt smaller, as if the night itself had drawn closer. As Claire murmured her thanks, Moreau knew that no matter how carefully he navigated what lay ahead, the past had already stepped across his threshold. Sleep, when it finally came, was the wrong kind. It slid over Inspector Moreau like a dull, uneasy tide barely covering the exposed rocks of his thoughts. He lay beside Madame Moreau, listening for a long time to the regular rhythm of her breathing, the occasional creak of the building as it settled deeper into the night. When, his eyes closed at last, he found no rest in darkness, only a road leading back to the station platform of Saint-Malo-sur-Seine, and to a younger version of himself stepping down from a provincial carriage with a suitcase in one hand and a leather folder pressed beneath his arm. The mist had been thinner there, almost shy, curling around the low roofs and the narrow river that wound its way beyond the fields. He remembered the way the town smelled the first time he arrived: damp stone, coal smoke from stoves, and the faint, stubborn sweetness of baking bread that seemed always on the verge of burning. It had been early in his career, before Paris and its endless corridors of files, before the Quai des Orfèvres consumed his days with other people's tragedies. In Saint-Malo-sur-Seine, each case had felt like a test, as though the town itself were watching him to see whether he would be the sort of man who disturbed its sleep or protected it from nightmares. The memory of his first encounter with Claire Rousseau was tangled in that atmosphere. He saw her again as she had been then, crossing the small square with a parcel of papers beneath her arm, her hair pinned back in a simple knot, her gait brisk but never hurried. She had worked in the office of the notary, a fact that had put her at the crossroads of the town's discreet transactions, wills, property, debts that families pretended not to discuss. In those days, he had noticed her the way a stranger notices a familiar landmark in a foreign place, something the eye returns to without understanding why. Their actual conversations had been few and brief, but there had been a certain frankness in the way she looked at him, a lack of the guarded deference he found in other townsfolk when they spoke to a visiting inspector. She had not seemed impressed by his title or intimidated by his uniform. Instead, she seemed quietly amused, as if she recognized in him another outsider pretending to have roots. The town had not been hostile, not in the crude sense. It was simply closed, like shutters drawn against a storm even when the sky was clear. The cafes held their regular rhythm of card games and old men smoking pipes. The church bells sounded with punctual piety, and the small station received and dispatched its modest procession of trains. But beneath these routines, Moreau had felt a tension, the sense that certain stories were being told too smoothly, certain misfortunes too quickly accepted. The disappearance of Claire Rousseau had torn the curtain for a brief moment, exposing something raw. The town had sewn it back with hurried stitches, and he had allowed the seam to pass inspection. That was what now troubled him most as he drifted in and out of uneasy dreams. Not that he had failed to see, but that he had seen enough to know he was being steered away and had let himself be led. In the early hours of the morning, half awake, the sound of a distant train filtered through his memory. And he found himself once more in the office the town had lent him during the investigation. The room had been cramped and cold, with damp stains on the walls and a single window overlooking the back of the notary's building. He recalled the landlord's face, the man who had rented a small furnished room to Claire, pale with indignation when questioned, his statements delivered with rehearsed outrage. Mademoiselle Rousseau was respectable, he had insisted, wiping his hands on a threadbare cloth. If she left in the night, it was not by my knowledge. Women like her don't vanish. They go somewhere, Inspector. Perhaps she found better prospects. Perhaps such matters are not for us to pry into. The words had seemed reasonable, even comforting. Yet Moreau, even then, had felt the resistance behind them, the determination to close a door without checking the lock. He had walked the streets of Saint-Malo-sur-Seine in those days, with his collar turned up against the wind, asking discreet questions in bakeries and cafes, listening not only to what was said, but to the silence that followed. Certain names recurred in that silence, Etienne Valin among them. Valin had been hard to define, a man without fixed occupation but with an uncanny ability to appear where decisions were being made. Some called him a broker, others a consultant or a friend of influential families. His clothes had been of good quality, though his address remained uncertain. He gambled just enough to suggest ease, but never so much as to invite scandal. To the young inspector, Valin had seemed like a thread left dangling from an expensive coat, something no one dared cut away for fear of unraveling the entire garment. When Claire vanished, the thread disappeared with her. In his drifting half-sleep, Moreau saw again the town's railway station, on the morning when he had considered the possibility that Claire had boarded a train of her own free will. The station-master, with his red nose and watery eyes, had assured him that no young woman matching her description had left on the likely days. Yet there had been an odd pause before the answer, a quick glance toward the office in the back where records were kept. Moreau, lacking proof and pressed by superiors to conclude his inquiries, had accepted the explanation. Now, years later, lying in his Paris apartment with Claire Rousseau breathing in the next room, he realized how much of that investigation had depended on the goodwill of men who had an interest in forgetting. He woke fully just before dawn, the faint bluish light leaking around the edges of the shutters. Madame Moreau still slept, her hand resting lightly on the blanket between them. He watched her for a moment, experiencing a sharp awareness that his past and present had collided in this small space, that the woman in the next room carried a part of his life that his wife had never fully known. It was not a matter of infidelity or romantic regret. It was something more elusive, a reminder of the young man he had been and the doubts he had learned to disguise behind official conclusions. Careful not to wake her, he slipped from the bed, dressed quietly, and stepped into the corridor. The air smelled of cooling ash from stoves and the faint aroma of coffee beginning to brew in some neighbor's kitchen. For an instant, he feared Claire might have gone, that her presence had been nothing more than a spectre conjured by an unfinished conscience. But when he opened the door to the small guest room, he found her lying fully clothed on the coverlet, her coat folded over a chair, her shoes set side by side on the floor. Her eyes were closed, but the tension in her features had not been smoothed by sleep. It was the face of someone resting on the edge of a cliff, aware that one wrong movement might send them plunging. He did not wake her. Instead, he moved to the kitchen, set water to heat, and ground coffee with a steady rhythm that drew his mind into focus. The simple, domestic sounds contrasted sharply with the weight of the memories pressing against him. As he poured the dark liquid into 2 cups, he realized there was no avoiding the journey back to Saint-Malo-sur-Seine. The town still existed, with its station, its square, its cafes, and its inhabitants who had long since adjusted to a version of the past that suited them. But perhaps the years had loosened tongues. Perhaps those who had once feared Valin's influence had grown old enough to care less about consequences. When Claire appeared at the kitchen door, her hair hastily brushed and her face washed but still bearing the pallor of a sleepless night, he handed her a cup without ceremony. She accepted it with a hoarse murmur of thanks and wrapped both hands around the warmth as if afraid it might be taken from her. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "A little," she said. "Enough to remember what I tried so long to forget." She took a sip, winced at the heat, then met his gaze. "You're thinking of going back there, aren't you?" "Yes." Moreau did not soften the answer. "If Valin has returned, Saint-Malo-sur-Seine is where all of this began. Whatever hold he has, whatever he believes you still owe him, it started there. I cannot rely only on your memories. I need to see the town again, to hear what it says now." She nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around the cup. "You won't get the truth from them. They're good at pretending. They were even then." "So are we," he replied quietly. "But time changes people. Fear shifts, guilt ages. Sometimes what was once concealed becomes a burden they wish to lay down before it's too late." Her expression flickered with something like hope, quickly masked by caution. "I'm not sure guilt exists there. They were relieved when I disappeared. It made my questions, my doubts, vanish with me." He studied her over the rim of his own cup. "You spoke of him watching you, of something he believes you still have." "I need to know what that is, Claire." She shook her head, her eyes sliding away. "Not yet. If I tell you now, you'll rush at it like a man trying to put out a fire with his hands. You must see Saint-Malo first, as it is now. Only then will you understand why I ran and why he thinks I can still threaten him." Moreau considered insisting, but years of questioning had taught him that some testimonies hardened under pressure instead of yielding. There was time yet, though he sensed that every hour brought Valin closer, like a tide creeping toward a fragile sandcastle. He glanced at the clock on the wall. At this hour, the offices at the Quai des Orfèvres would not yet be fully alive. He could send a telegram ahead, request a brief leave under some pretext of follow-up work on an old file. He had cultivated a reputation for persistence. No one would be truly surprised. And if they harbored doubts, they were unlikely to voice them openly. "You will stay here," he told Claire. "My wife will not ask many questions. She is kind, but she knows there are parts of my work she is better off not examining too closely. I will inform her only that you are a witness I must protect. It is not entirely untrue." Claire's lips trembled in a faint, grateful smile. "Henri, if you go back there, be careful whom you trust. Some of those men built their lives on the silence of that time. They won't appreciate you stirring the dust." "I know," he said. And he did. The provincial town of his memory rose before him again, not as a quaint backdrop, but as a living organism with its own instincts of self-preservation. He could see the notary's office, its dark wooden door worn by generations of hands. The cafe where farmers and merchants sat with their backs to the wall, watching newcomers with wary curiosity. The narrow lane leading to the house where Claire had once rented her room. Each corner held the echo of a conversation that had once circled around her disappearance and then moved on, satisfied with a convenient explanation. As he drained the last of his coffee, the decision felt less like a choice and more like the inevitable continuation of a path begun 20 years earlier. The past was not merely knocking at his door, it was calling him back to where he had first learned the difference between truth and what people agreed to accept in its place. He set his cup down with quiet finality. "I will leave by the afternoon train," he said. "By tonight I will be walking those streets again." Claire watched him, her eyes shadowed by a fear that seemed to reach beyond her own safety. "If he knows you're there," she whispered, "Valine won't hide. He never hides when he thinks he holds the stronger hand." Moreau did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned to the window, where the first pale light of day was filtering through the mist, blurring the shapes of neighboring rooftops. Paris was waking, indifferent to his decision, as it always was to the private battles of those who served within its institutions. He placed his hand on the cool glass, feeling the faint vibration of the city beneath his fingertips. Somewhere beyond the fog, trains were already preparing to depart, their destinations written in chalk on station boards. One of them would carry him back to Saint-Malo-sur-Seine, to the town that had never quite released its hold on him. The echo of that place, its streets, its secrets, its silences, was no longer just memory. It was a summons, and this time he would not let the town decide which truths were allowed to survive. "Then let him think that," Moreau murmured at last. "For once, it may be useful if Etienne Valin believes the past still belongs to him." Inspector Moreau left his apartment later that morning with the deliberate calm of a man accustomed to concealing the turmoil beneath his surface. Paris had slipped into its subdued winter rhythm. The air felt damp and metallic, carrying the faint odor of coal smoke drifting from chimneys. The fog, denser than usual, clung to the buildings like a shawl shaken loose by the night. Moreau drew his coat tighter around himself, glancing once at the window where he knew Claire Rousseau waited, hidden by the shutters. Though she had not spoken it aloud, she feared being seen even more than being found, and Moreau carried that unspoken dread with him like an invisible burden. He moved through the streets with practiced composure, returning nods to shopkeepers opening their shutters, acknowledging the polite greeting of the concierge, who had never once questioned the odd hours at which the inspector came and went. At the corner, he paused beneath a gas lamp whose flame trembled at the persistence of the fog. He felt the weight of the city upon him, a weight he knew well, a mixture of vigilance and indifference. Paris never truly slept, but at certain hours it watched instead of stirring, as if waiting for a story to unfold. This morning, the city seemed unusually alert, as though it recognized that one of its old ghosts had slipped back into its streets. At the Quai des Orfèvres, he greeted Janvier and Lucas with his usual restrained warmth. Their eyes darted briefly to the small travel bag he carried, but neither asked questions. Years of working alongside Moreau had taught them that certain investigations required discretion even among colleagues. He entered his office, closed the door, and allowed himself a moment to breathe in the familiar scent of paper, dust, and cold metal filing drawers. It steadied him, grounding him in the present despite the memories that tugged at him like persistent weeds. He penned a telegram to the small station master at Saint-Malo-sur-Seine, using a tone brisk enough to evoke compliance without inviting curiosity. Inspector Henri Moreau will arrive by evening train. Request confirmation of old case file. Availability. He hesitated before adding, "No public inquiry." It was better to announce his presence before arriving. Surprises unsettled small towns, and he did not wish to give Valin an advantage, assuming the man truly lingered there or had kept ties in place. When he emerged from his office, Janvier was leaning casually against the corridor wall, smoking an early cigarette despite the préfet's disapproval of such habits inside the building. He flicked ash neatly into a small tray perched on a radiator. "Leaving Paris?" he asked, his tone light but his eyes sharp. "Just for a day," Moreau replied. Janvier tilted his head. "Old ghosts?" "Something like that." Janvier shifted his weight, studying him with the quiet intelligence that had always made him invaluable. "If you need eyes here while you're gone, Lucas and I can arrange it." Moreau considered this for a brief moment. Claire's description of Valin standing across the boulevard had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. If the man had been in Paris recently, he might still be walking the same streets, brushing shoulders with unsuspecting clerks, slipping into cafes where he could watch unnoticed. "Yes," Moreau said finally. "I want you to speak with our contacts near the river, not openly, just listen. If anyone matching his description is seen again, I want to know before I return." Janvier nodded once, the gesture crisp. "Understood." Moreau thanked him with a brief incline of his head and stepped into the chill of the morning once more. His next task was to find a place for Claire to stay while he traveled. Bringing her to a station or allowing her to wander the city alone was unthinkable. She needed a refuge far removed from prying eyes. He chose a small hotel near the Place des Vosges, one he had used before when protecting vulnerable witnesses from curious journalists or vindictive acquaintances. Its facade blended seamlessly with the neighboring buildings, offering anonymity without neglect. The proprietress, Madame Lenoir, recognized him at once, her eyes bright beneath her tidy gray hair. She was a woman of few words and boundless discretion, making her establishment invaluable on more than one occasion. "I will send a young woman shortly," he told her quietly. "She will check in under her own name. Treat her as you would any guest, but see that her room is not assigned adjacent to strangers who come and go at odd hours." Madame Lenoir nodded. "A widow fleeing an unpleasant relative?" "Something of the kind," Moreau answered. "She will need rest and quiet." "You shall have both," Madame Lenoir replied with reassuring confidence. From there, Moreau made his way back through the fog-stricken streets to his apartment. Claire was in the sitting room when he entered, standing near the window with her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She turned sharply at the sound of the door, and only when she recognized him did some of the tension ease from her shoulders. "I thought—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "You thought I might not return," Moreau concluded gently. She lowered her eyes. "People disappear so easily in this city." "You won't," he replied. "I've arranged a place for you, a quiet hotel. A woman I trust will ensure your safety while I'm away." Claire inhaled slowly, as if bracing herself against the next stage of an ordeal she had not yet fully articulated. "And you still intend to go back?" "I must," he said simply. "Saint-Malo holds answers you cannot give me alone." Her chin trembled, though she tried to steady it. "You don't know what that town is capable of when it feels threatened." "I remember," Moreau said softly. "But I also remember what they hid. People speak differently after 20 years, and if Valin has returned, the shadows he cast may be larger than they once were." She reached for her coat, fastening the buttons with trembling fingers. Moreau watched her silently, feeling again the weight of a responsibility he had not anticipated, but could not refuse. When she looked at him again, her eyes held something fragile, trust without certainty. "I'll go," she said. "Show me where to stay." The walk to the hotel was uneventful, though Claire glanced over her shoulder often, scanning doorways and alley mouths with the vigilance of someone accustomed to danger. Paris, in its morning fog, felt both protective and ominous. The streets were not empty, but those who passed them did so with their collars raised and their heads lowered, intent on their own destinations. Claire moved quietly beside him, sometimes close enough that her shoulder brushed his sleeve, as though proximity to him offered some invisible shield. When they reached the hotel, Madame Lenoir offered a polite greeting, her expression betraying no curiosity. Claire was shown to a small room on the third floor overlooking a courtyard where ivy climbed the walls in stubborn defiance of the season. She stood in the center of the room for several long moments, breathing in the stillness. "It's safe," Moreau said, though even he could not claim certainty. "I will return tomorrow night, perhaps the following morning." She nodded, folding her hands tightly in front of her. "If he finds me—" "He won't," Moreau interrupted gently but firmly. "And if he tries, Madame Lenoir will see him before he reaches your door. Trust that." Claire closed her eyes briefly, drawing strength from the reassurance even if part of her doubted it. "Henri, be careful. Valin is not the same man you once suspected. He has learned things. He has friends." "So have I," Moreau replied with quiet resolve. Leaving her was more difficult than he anticipated. There lingered a sensation that he was walking away from the center of a storm rather than stepping out of it, but he reminded himself that the journey back to Saint-Malo-sur-Seine was essential. The past had begun its slow encroachment the moment Claire knocked on his door, and now the only way forward was through the place where her story, and his early misgivings, had begun. By midday, he was at Gare Montparnasse, the fog lifting just enough for the iron tracks to emerge like parallel threads stretching toward the horizon. The station bustled with the muted urgency of routine travel. Porters stacking luggage, vendors arranging their newspapers and pastries, clerks stamping tickets with mechanical precision. The train to Saint-Malo-sur-Seine awaited with its wooden compartments and soot-smudged windows, the scent of coal mingling with the cold air. Moreau boarded, choosing a seat by the window. As the train lurched forward and Paris began to recede, he watched the city's rooftops drift into the mist like islands swallowed by tide. His reflection in the window pane looked older than he felt, lines etched by years of enforcing truth in places where truth was rarely welcome. He could not shake Claire's trembling voice, the haunted look in her eyes when she mentioned Valin. There had been no theatrics in her fear, no embellishment. It was the fear of someone who had spent too long in hiding, someone who knew the face of her tormentor better than she wished. Outside, the scenery shifted from dense rows of buildings to stretches of countryside veiled in frost. Bare trees stood like skeletal sentinels against the pale sky, their branches reaching toward the passing train as though urging him onward. Fields lay dormant, the earth stiff with winter, and small villages appeared at intervals, clusters of houses with smoke curling timidly from their chimneys. Each glimpse passed too quickly to linger, yet they carried the unmistakable texture of rural life, familiar in their quiet endurance. Moreau's thoughts wandered as the train continued its steady rhythm. He recalled Valin's guarded smile, the way the man used to tilt his head slightly when answering questions, as though listening for a trap within Moreau's words. Valin had always struck him as someone who understood leverage intimately, someone who knew where people's vulnerabilities lay and how to pull at those threads without ever appearing to tug. If Valin was indeed alive and in Paris, as Claire claimed, then the years had likely refined those talents, and if he had chosen to reappear now, it was not by coincidence. Someone does not remain hidden for 20 years, only to resurface without purpose. The train slowed as it approached a small station where passengers disembarked with stiff limbs and hurried steps, eager to escape the cold that seeped through the compartment doors. Moreau remained seated, watching a young couple help an elderly woman with her luggage. The small gesture held a simplicity he found strangely grounding. Not everything in the world was shadowed. Not everyone hid behind facades. Yet the matters that demanded his attention always seemed to involve those who did. When the train resumed its pace, Moreau leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. He allowed the steady clatter of wheels on tracks to lull his thoughts into a measured calm. He needed clarity for what awaited him. Saint-Malo-sur-Seine was not merely a place on a map. It was a web of old loyalties, secrets preserved out of habit, and truths distorted by convenience. He had walked those streets once as an inexperienced officer, eager to prove his competence. This time, he would walk them with a different purpose, to untangle the threads of a story that had been woven tightly enough to choke the truth into silence. The train whistle pierced the air, sharp and forlorn, announcing its final approach. Moreau opened his eyes to see the town emerging through the thinning fog, the familiar contours of its station platform taking shape. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Not fear exactly, but the heavy weight of inevitability. The air around the station carried the faint scent of damp stone and wood, the same scent that had greeted him 20 years earlier. It was as though the town had waited in stillness, unchanged, knowing he would one day return. As he stepped down onto the platform, the air felt colder, heavier, filled with the unspoken expectation of a story long paused, now demanding continuation. He adjusted his coat, lifted his bag, and walked toward the station exit, each step drawing him deeper into the echoes he had tried to leave behind. Saint-Malo-sur-Seine had remembered him, and now, at last, he had returned its gaze. Saint-Malo-sur-Seine greeted Inspector Moreau with the same muted suspicion it had worn 20 years earlier, as though the town regarded every newcomer with the quiet calculation of a chess player deciding whether to sacrifice a pawn. The station platform, with its peeling paint and dull gray tiles, slickened by the afternoon damp, seemed to exhale an air of reluctant familiarity. Moreau tightened his grip on the small leather bag he carried, stepping forward with the brisk, measured pace of a man who knew he was being watched, if not by people, then by memory itself. The sun, veiled behind a layer of pale clouds, offered little warmth, and the faint scent of wet earth carrying from the river surrounded him like an old habit he had never entirely broken. The station master emerged from his office with the same stiff gait that Moreau remembered from decades past, though now softened by age. A knitted scarf wrapped around his neck did little to hide the wary curiosity in his eyes as he approached. "Inspector Moreau," he said, tipping his hat with restrained politeness. "Your telegram arrived, of course. We've gathered what we could find from the old case files. It's been many years." "Years don't change facts," Moreau replied, though even he felt uncertain of the truth of that statement. "Only the way people choose to recall them." The station master nodded, his gaze flickering briefly toward the edge of the platform where a group of townsfolk lingered. Their conversations had paused the moment the inspector disembarked, and now they pretended to examine luggage or scan the schedule board while never quite turning their backs. Saint-Malo-sur-Seine was too small to disguise its curiosity. Moreau felt the familiar prickle of eyes tracing his movements, as though the town itself were trying to decipher his purpose before he declared it. Inside the modest station office, the air was thick with dust and old paper. Wooden shelves sagged beneath the weight of records bound in twine, and the single kerosene lamp flickered as if reluctant to illuminate the forgotten corners it had grown accustomed to ignoring. The station master retrieved a slim folder tied with yellowing string and placed it gently on the table between them. "This is what remained of your inquiry," he said. "The rest was sent to the prefecture decades ago, I believe. Some documents may have been misplaced." Misplaced, a word that did not fool Moreau then and certainly did not now. He untied the string, letting the brittle pages fall open. His younger handwriting stared back at him. Neat, precise, and tinged with the eagerness of an inspector who believed that any discrepancy, any crack in a witness's account, could be pried open to reveal truth. But the cracks had been plastered over by townsfolk with steady hands and silent agreements. He skimmed the brief statements, the landlord's testimony, the notary's vague recollections. Claire Rousseau's disappearance had been reduced to a few paragraphs, each line stripping away complexity until she became a mere footnote in the town's history. As Moreau folded the file shut, the station master cleared his throat. "If you don't mind my asking, Inspector, why reopen this matter now, after so long?" Moreau's eyes met the older man's. "Because someone believes the past has returned." The station master stiffened, his jaw tightening before he forced a thin smile. "The past has a habit of disturbing those who invite it. Best to let sleeping ghosts rest, wouldn't you say?" "Ghosts rarely stay asleep on their own," Moreau replied as he stood. "Thank you for your assistance." He stepped back outside, the cold air filling his lungs with a harsh clarity. Saint-Malo-sur-Seine lay spread before him like a painting left to fade at its edges. A small bridge arching over the river, a row of shops with weathered awnings, the narrow lanes stretching toward modest houses with shuttered windows. The sounds were muted. A distant dog barking, a cart's wheel creaking along cobblestones, the faint clatter of dishes from a nearby cafe. Yet beneath the quiet, Moreau sensed the pulse of tension, an unspoken question that drifted like smoke. Why had he come back? He walked toward the notary's office, where Claire had once worked. The building stood unchanged, its wooden sign worn but legible, its door polished to a shine that suggested habit rather than pride. Inside, the smell of ink and old parchment lingered as it had years ago. The current notary, a stern man with narrow shoulders and a meticulous mustache, looked up from his desk as Moreau entered. Recognition flickered in his eyes, though they quickly returned to their practiced neutrality. "Inspector," he said, standing with formal courtesy. "I heard you had returned to town. A rare visit." "Some matters remain unresolved," Moreau replied. "I'm here to clarify them." The notary gestured to a chair. 20 years is a long time. People move on. Memories soften or harden, Moreau countered, depending on what they conceal. A slight pause. The notary folded his hands. "If this is about Mademoiselle Rousseau, I doubt I can say more now than I did then. She left no traces, no letters. She simply vanished." "People rarely vanish without leaving shadows behind them," Moreau said. "It's the shadows I've come to retrieve." The notary stiffened, though his voice remained polite. "If you are implying scandal, Inspector, let me assure you, this town has its integrity." "Integrity doesn't erase truth," Moreau replied. "It only obscures it." Something in the notary's expression faltered, revealing a flicker of unease. "There are things," he murmured, almost to himself, "that are better left alone. For everyone's sake." Before Moreau could respond, the door opened behind him and a man stepped in. A tall figure in a dark coat, his face half-shadowed under the brim of a hat. He paused when he saw Moreau, his eyes narrowing in brief, sharp assessment. Then he inclined his head to the notary. "Forgive me. I didn't realize you had company." "No matter," the notary said quickly. "We were concluding." Moreau studied the stranger, a man in his late 40s or early 50s with a calm, deliberate manner. Something in his gaze lingered too long, as though he were memorizing the inspector's features. The gesture was subtle, almost respectful, but it sent a small chill down Moreau's spine. The man stepped aside to allow the inspector to pass, offering a courteous nod that felt strangely rehearsed. Moreau returned the gesture but kept walking, his senses sharpened. Back outside, he paused under the awning, scanning the street. The fog was lifting, revealing more of the town's contours, but it brought no comfort. Instead, it seemed to unveil the weight of years pressing against every wall and doorway. He turned toward the river. The water flowed sluggishly beneath the small bridge, its surface reflecting the pale sky in wavering fragments. Near the embankment, a figure stood with his hands in his coat pockets, gazing at the water. His posture was relaxed, almost contemplative. But when he slowly turned his head, Moreau felt a jolt of recognition, not of the man himself, but of the expression he wore. A faint smile, knowing and detached, like someone who had been expecting him. A breath caught in Moreau's throat, though the distance made details indistinct. The shape of the face, the angle of the chin, something in the silhouette struck him with the force of déjà vu. Claire's trembling whisper echoed in his mind. I saw him. The same coat, the same faint smile. But before Moreau could move, a passing cart rolled between them. When it cleared, the embankment was empty. Moreau exhaled slowly, the cold burning his lungs. Whether the figure had been real or a trick of his own unsettled mind, he could not say. But the unease coiling inside him urged him onward. He crossed the bridge and made his way to the house where Claire had once rented her room. The door still bore the same iron knocker shaped like a lion's head, though its paint had chipped further with time. He hesitated only a moment before raising his hand and knocking firmly. The door opened a crack, revealing the wrinkled face of the landlord. The same man, older now but unmistakable. His eyes widened when he saw the inspector, and a flicker of something, fear or irritation, passed across his features. You again, he muttered. Me, Moreau said calmly. We need to talk. I've nothing more to say about that girl, the landlord snapped, attempting to close the door. Moreau blocked it with his hand. You had nothing to say then. Times change. People forget things they were told to remember, and remember things they were told to forget. The landlord's jaw clenched. You're stirring old ashes. The fire's long gone, Inspector. Moreau leaned in slightly. Fires leave embers. The landlord swallowed, then stepped back, allowing him inside. The entryway smelled of dust and stale tobacco. Moreau followed him into a cramped parlor where a clock ticked loudly, each second cutting through the tension like a knife. Why now? The landlord asked, sinking into a chair. Why after all these years? Because the man she feared may be alive, Moreau replied. And if he is, he may have returned here. To finish what he began. The landlord paled visibly. His hands trembled. No, that cannot be. He was gone. He was meant to stay gone. Moreau's breath caught. So you knew. Silence swallowed the room. Then the landlord nodded, barely perceptible, as though confessing to the air rather than to the inspector before him. He told us she left of her own accord, the landlord said hoarsely. Told us not to question it. Some of us, we didn't dare. The notary, the mayor, a few others, they said it was better that way. For the town. For the town, Moreau repeated bitterly. And Valin? The landlord's eyes flicked to the window. He said he would return one day. Said he would know if anyone spoke about him. Moreau felt the cold seep deeper into him, an icy thread weaving itself through his thoughts. And now, he asked softly, do you believe he's back? The landlord lowered his gaze. I believe the river carries back what we throw into it, and some things float longer than we expect. A silence followed, heavy and suffocating. When Moreau finally stepped outside, the fog had thinned enough to reveal the outlines of the town more clearly, but the clarity brought no relief. Instead, it exposed a truth he had long suspected. Claire Rousseau had never been the only one swallowed by that old investigation. The entire town had been complicit, through fear, through convenience, through obedience to a man who should have vanished forever. But Etienne Valin, it seemed, had not vanished. He had simply waited, and now he was awake again. Inspector Moreau walked back toward the center of Saint-Malo-sur-Seine with the landlord's trembling confession echoing inside him. The town felt altered, not in the sense of new buildings or changed streets, but in the subtle way a familiar face appears different after learning a secret it has been hiding. What had once seemed like mere provincial reserve now resembled a wide, deliberate silence, the kind shared by accomplices rather than neighbors. The fog had thinned further, but the air carried a heaviness that felt almost moral, as if the town itself exhaled the weight of all it had suppressed. Moreau stopped at the small square, letting the scene unfold around him, The waiter brushing crumbs off cafe tables, the butcher unloading crates from a cart, the old widow feeding scraps of bread to a cluster of pigeons. Everyday life continued with the same mechanical precision, he remembered, but beneath it, something in the rhythm faltered, as though the gears of the town's routines were missing a familiar friction now that an old secret had stirred. He crossed the square and entered Le Cyprès Bleu, the cafe where he had once interviewed townsfolk who preferred diverting stories to uncomfortable truths. The interior was almost unchanged. The faint odor of stale beer, the clatter of cups behind the bar, the scratched wooden tables polished smooth by decades of elbows and restless fingers. Only the faces had aged. Marcel, the cafe owner, looked up as Moreau stepped inside. His eyebrows shot upward, not quite masking the jolt of recognition. "Well," Marcel said, forcing a dry chuckle, "as I live and breathe. Inspector Moreau. Back for our local cuisine after 20 years? "Back for answers," Moreau replied, removing his gloves and taking a seat at a corner table. "Some things left unfinished have a way of returning." Marcel hesitated, glancing at the two laborers near the window who pretended not to listen. He poured a coffee with exaggerated care and brought it to Moreau's table. "We've managed plenty fine without digging up the past," he said quietly. "Old stories don't age well. They turn sour." "Only when the truth was spoiled from the beginning," Moreau said. Marcel exhaled sharply. "You never did speak like a provincial, always too direct." "You always avoided looking a man in the eyes when lying," Moreau replied calmly. Marcel's jaw tightened. "You think I lied to you back then?" "I think you were told what to say." Silence stretched between them. Then Marcel lowered himself into the chair opposite Moreau, his shoulders sagging. "You're looking for news about her, aren't you?" "Claire Rousseau." Moreau said nothing, but the lack of denial was answer enough. Marcel rubbed a hand over his thinning hair, the motion revealing the tremor he had tried to hide. "We were all told she'd run off," Marcel murmured. "Told to keep the story simple. Valine said it would prevent scandal," the mayor agreed, said the town didn't need outsiders poking around. "And you listened," Moreau said. "We always listened to Valine," Marcel whispered. "Back then, he had a way of making you believe he knew something about you, something you didn't want others to hear. He wasn't a brute, never raised a hand, but he didn't need to. He saw through people, and when he smiled—" Marcel shuddered. It felt like a warning. Moreau felt Claire's trembling voice return to him. The same faint smile. He leaned forward. "You said back then, why speak as if he were still here?" Marcel looked around quickly, lowering his voice even further. "Because there have been murmurs over the years. People seeing a man they swear looked like him, on the riverbank, near the station, outside the old mill. Always fleeting. No one speaks openly of it. Because they fear he'll come knocking." "Because they fear he never truly left," Marcel said. "And if he stayed in hiding, he must have had a reason." Moreau absorbed this quietly. "Did anyone ever see him with Claire before she disappeared?" Marcel's eyes flashed with something like guilt. There were whispers. "He came to the notary's office once, though I don't know why. They said he visited her landlord more than once. And a week before she vanished, someone saw them standing near the station, talking. She looked upset. Very upset." "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Moreau asked. Marcel's face tightened. "Because by the time you arrived, Valin had already made it clear that certain conversations were unnecessary. We were all encouraged to let the matter fade." "Encouraged," Moreau repeated. "Or threatened." Marcel flinched. "What's the difference, Inspector? When a man like Valin knows how to make secrets feel heavier." Moreau sipped his coffee, letting the bitter flavor anchor his rising frustration. This town, with all its quiet repression and polite obedience, had conspired through cowardice more than malice. Yet cowardice could bury truth just as effectively as cruelty. A shadow fell across the table. Moreau looked up to find a young man, no more than 20, standing hesitantly nearby. His cap was crumpled in his hands, and his eyes darted nervously between Moreau and the door. "Excuse me, monsieur," the young man said softly, "but I heard you're asking about a man named Valine." Marcel stiffened. "Jean, don't involve yourself." Jean ignored him, leaning closer to Moreau. "I work near the river, the docks. 3 nights ago, I was unloading crates when I saw a man standing by the water, tall, dark coat, watching the warehouses. I thought it strange. So late. When I approached, he stared at me. Not hostile, but knowing, like he recognized me. Then he walked off toward the old mill." Moreau's pulse quickened. "Did you recognize him?" Jean hesitated. "I saw a sketch once, in an old newspaper clipping. A man wanted for questioning after a disappearance. Could have been him. The eyes were the same." Marcel grabbed the young man's arm. "Enough! You'll bring trouble on yourself speaking like this." Jean pulled free, fear flickering across his face. Maybe trouble's already here. Then he hurried from the cafe, leaving behind an uneasy silence. Moreau turned back to Marcel. "The old mill, does anyone still use it?" Marcel swallowed. "It's abandoned. Has been for years. But people say lights appear there sometimes. Late at night. No one goes close." "Superstition?" Moreau asked. "Or something worse," Marcel murmured. Moreau stood, placing a few francs on the table. "Thank you, Marcel, for speaking honestly this time." Marcel rose as well, his voice barely audible. "Inspector, don't go there alone. If Valine truly returned, he won't like you sniffing around what he left behind." "I've faced worse men," Moreau said. "Not like him," Marcel replied. "He's patient, he waits, and he never forgets." The words followed Moreau out into the street, sinking into his thoughts like hooks. The fog had thinned enough to reveal the far end of town, where the silhouette of the abandoned mill rose against the pale sky. A current of wind blew through the square, carrying with it the scent of damp timber and old stone, and the faint, unmistakable scent of the river that had held so many of the town's secrets. He walked without haste, letting the streets guide him past the bakeries, past the shuttered houses whose windows seemed to blink with suspicion, past the quiet courtyard where he had once questioned a mother who refused to look him in the eye. Each step brought him nearer to the outskirts, where the cobblestones gave way to dirt paths and the river widened into a slow-moving expanse of murky water. The old mill stood alone at the bend, a gaunt structure of weathered wood and stone, its wheel broken, its windows gaping like missing teeth. An air of abandonment clung to it, yet something about its posture felt alert, as if it were listening for footsteps. Moreau approached carefully, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. As he reached the threshold, he paused, scanning the surroundings. A crow cawed overhead, breaking the fragile quiet. The door, crooked on its hinges, hung halfway open. Moreau pushed it gently, and it creaked inward, revealing a dim interior littered with sawdust, broken crates, and remnants of forgotten labor. The scent of mildew clung to the air, but beneath it was another smell, faint yet recognizable. Cigarette smoke, fresh. Someone had been here recently. He stepped inside, senses sharpened. Boot prints marked the dusty floor, large, deliberate steps leading deeper into the mill. He followed them, moving between crates until he reached the far corner where a small wooden crate lay covered by a cloth. Moreau lifted the cloth. Inside the crate rested a ledger bound in dark leather. His breath caught. A ledger. Claire had spoken of one. Valin's ledger. He reached for it and stopped. A familiar, faint smile appeared in the darkness behind him. "You really shouldn't have come back, Inspector." Moreau froze. The voice, smooth, cold, unmistakably confident, slid through the shadows like a blade. He turned slowly, And there, standing half-hidden in the dim light, was the man Saint-Malo-sur-Seine had feared for decades. Etienne Valin, alive, watching him with the same calm amusement Claire had described, and smiling. For a suspended heartbeat, neither man moved. The dim light filtering through the cracks in the mill's walls painted Valin's face in fractured lines, as though the years he had spent in the shadows could not fully gather themselves into a single image. The faint smile remained, fixed in that unsettling balance between courtesy and threat. Moreau studied him with a steadiness earned from decades of interrogating liars, thieves, and men who relied on confidence like a weapon. But Valin's confidence was older, colder, carved from something deeper than arrogance. It was the quiet certainty of a man convinced the world would always bend before he did. "You're difficult to discourage, Inspector," Valin said, stepping forward with the composed grace of a predator unhurried by the presence of another. His coat, dark wool of excellent quality, hung neatly on his lean frame, defying the dust and decay around them. His hair, once thick and dark, bore threads of silver now, but his eyes were unchanged, sharp, observant, and devoid of remorse. Moreau kept his voice calm. "You've been expected." Valin tilted his head lightly, as though amused. "Expected? No one has expected me in 2 decades. They hoped I'd vanished, hoped the river would finish what they lacked the courage to do." "And you?" Moreau asked. "Did you vanish willingly, or was someone helping you disappear?" A flicker passed across Valin's features, quick as the flash of a blade in the dark. "I go where necessity directs," he said. "As do you, apparently, though I must say, returning here was a bold choice. Rare for a man of your discipline to let an old case cloud his judgment." Moreau stepped closer, careful to keep his footing silent on the uneven boards. "Claire Rousseau came to Paris. She believes you're following her." Valin's smile deepened. "Believes she is followed, believes she is hunted. Poor Claire always did imagine shadows where there were none. Fear can be a persuasive storyteller." "She didn't imagine you at Boulevard Richard Lenoir," Moreau countered. "Or here, by the river." Valin shrugged softly. "We all haunt the places that built us. I thought it would amuse me to see what remains of this charming town." He lifted his gaze to the rafters, as though considering the building itself. "Time is less kind to wood than to men. Yet you always return to cities," Moreau said. "To power, influence. Claire claims you kept a ledger. Names, debts, secrets. Are you here to reclaim it?" The ledger in the crate seemed a pulse with its own quiet presence, drawing both their eyes for an instant. Valin tapped a finger lightly against his coat. Claire always misunderstood the nature of information. She thought it binds others, but information, real information, binds the one who possesses it, makes him responsible for others' frailties. A tiresome burden, truth be told. "You tormented her," Moreau said. Valin raised an eyebrow, the gesture slow and calculated. "I guided her, encouraged her to see the world's vulnerabilities. She misinterpreted guidance for threat, a habit of hers." He paused. "But you, Inspector Moreau, had the gift of certainty. Even as a young man, you believed truth was something you could approach like a witness's desk. I wondered if time would teach you otherwise. And now you're here to teach me." "Hardly." Valin's smile dropped. "I am here because someone else stirred the waters. Someone who believes they can use the past as a lever." Moreau's pulse ticked higher. "Who?" Valin stepped aside from the shadows, revealing more of his face. Age had sharpened him, not weakened him. He looked like a man who had lived in the margins of society long enough to reinvent himself, but not long enough to forget the satisfaction of pulling invisible strings. "You think I answer to the whims of provincial towns?" he asked quietly. "Or even to the authorities in Paris?" "No, Inspector. Men of my profession, men of vision outgrow geography. As for Claire, His voice softened to a chilling murmur. Her reappearance is unfortunate. She always did choose inopportune moments to show courage. She came because she fears you. Valin chuckled, the sound disturbingly gentle. Fear is respect in another form. She came because she believes someone is trying to use your ledger, Moreau pressed. Someone who knows how you operated. Someone connected to the people who protected you. Valin's smile faded entirely. His eyes locked onto Moreau's with a gaze that cut through the haze of dust in the mill. "And what do you believe, Inspector?" Moreau felt the pressure of the moment building, though he kept his tone firm. "I believe Saint-Malo-sur-Seine kept silent because silence was profitable. I believe Paris harbors rooms where influence is bought with unspoken favors. And I believe you were never acting alone." Valin stepped closer, the floorboards groaning softly beneath him. "Careful," he murmured. "When men dig too far into the past, they do not always survive what they uncover." "Is that a threat?" "It is an observation," Valin said. "A common one." Moreau felt a cold certainty settle in him. "You're not afraid of me. You're afraid of someone else." Valin did not flinch, but his silence was answer enough. Then, unexpectedly, Valin turned away. He walked to a broken window and glanced out at the river, the faint wind stirring the edge of his coat. "Claire always misunderstood," he said softly, almost to himself. "She believed the ledger was about power, but power is never on paper. It lives in the men who gather it." "Why return now?" Moreau asked. Valin's mouth twisted. "Because someone in Paris believes themselves clever enough to resurrect old debts, and someone else, someone higher, believes this town might become inconvenient if the truth resurfaces." "Who?" Moreau demanded again. Valin turned back toward him, the faint smile returning, thinner and more dangerous. "You'll understand soon enough, but for now, we must part ways." He nodded toward the door behind Moreau. "You have company." Moreau pivoted. Outside, footsteps approached. Two men, strangers, walking with the casual confidence of those accustomed to doing unpleasant work. Their silhouettes stretched across the grass, merging with the dim afternoon light. When Moreau looked back at Valin, the man was already gone, vanished deeper into the mill or through some hidden exit, leaving behind only the faint scent of cigarette smoke. The footsteps drew closer. Moreau stepped into the shadows. The men entered the mill, their coats damp from the river fog. One looked around and muttered, "He was here." The other hissed, "We're not supposed to be seen." You know what the préfet said. The préfet. Moreau's pulse tightened. That single word changed the entire shape of the mystery, expanding it far beyond the boundaries of Saint-Malo-sur-Seine. The men moved deeper into the mill. Moreau remained perfectly still until they passed, then slipped out through the narrow side door Valin must have used. Outside, the fog had returned, swallowing the shapes of buildings and trees. The river murmured against its banks like a restless conspirator. Moreau breathed deeply, letting the shock settle into something sharper. He now knew three things with absolute clarity. He had not been mistaken. Valin was alive. Claire's terror had foundation, and the threatened silence of Saint-Malo-sur-Seine reached far beyond its borders. The préfet was involved. Perhaps not directly, perhaps not knowingly, but someone in the corridors of power had a reason to bury this case once more. Moreau tightened his coat and began walking toward the station. He needed to return to Paris, not just to protect Claire, but to understand the breadth of what he had stumbled into. Every step through the fog carried the weight of a realization that chilled him more than Valin's smile. This was no longer just about the past. It was about those in power today, those who feared exposure, those who still owed Valin, or feared what he knew. And Paris, a city that watched without blinking, was waiting. The train carried Inspector Moreau back toward Paris with the rhythmic insistence of wheels cutting through doubt. He sat alone in a compartment of muted green upholstery, his coat buttoned high, the faint tremor of the carriage humming beneath him like an unsettled heartbeat. Fields rolled past in indistinct sweeps of frost-laced grey, the countryside blurring into a landscape without edges. Valin's voice, smooth and unhurried, lingered in his mind like a scent trapped in fabric. The man had vanished so effortlessly, slipping into the mill's shadows as though the place itself had swallowed him, that Moreau might have doubted the encounter had it not been for the two men who entered moments later. The préfet. That single word had cleaved the case in two, revealing an unseen stratum beneath the surface. Valin was not merely a fugitive or a manipulator returning to finish an old score. He was intertwined with men who still occupied offices of influence. That truth pressed against Moreau with a weight that felt nearly physical. He was no stranger to political undercurrents at the Quai des Orfèvres. Every inspector eventually learned that certain investigations dissolved without explanation, certain files migrated to higher shelves, certain names were written only in ink that smudged easily. But this was different. Valin had been protected in the past, and now someone wanted him concealed again. As the train rattled onward, Moreau imagined Claire alone in her small hotel room, waking to the muted sounds of the courtyard, unaware of the storm gathering on the horizon. He had promised her safety, but the promise now felt like a fragile bridge built over a river that had already begun to rise. He leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes briefly, not to rest, but to gather himself. Claire's fear had not been hysteria, it had been memory. And memory, he realized, was a power Valin both feared and cultivated. When the train finally pulled into the Gare Montparnasse, Paris greeted him with a wind sharp enough to rip through the thin barrier of wool around his neck. The fog had thickened again, curling around the lamp-posts and washing the platforms in a yellow-stained haze. Moreau stepped onto the cold stones, the city's familiar hum whispering beneath the muffled quiet. He walked with quick, decisive strides, glancing occasionally over his shoulder, though he saw no one who resembled the two men from the mill. Still, unease pressed close, as if the fog itself carried watchers. At the hotel, Madame Lenoir greeted him with relief, softened by restraint. "Your guest is upstairs," she murmured, leading him toward the back staircase. "She did not sleep well. I brought her tea, but—" She trailed off, holding Moreau's gaze. "She's frightened, Inspector, and very tired." Moreau nodded, thanking her. As he ascended the narrow stairs, he felt the building's quiet settle around him like an old shawl. Warm, protective, yet fragile. When he reached Claire's room, he knocked gently. The door opened almost instantly. Claire stood before him, pale and hollow-eyed, her hair gathered loosely at her nape. She wore the same coat she had arrived in, as though changing her clothes might allow something unwanted to slip through the seams. The moment she saw Moreau, her breath caught, not in surprise, but in that raw mixture of relief and dread that accompanies bad news long feared. "You're back," she whispered. "I told you I would be." She stepped aside, and he entered. The small room smelled faintly of damp fabric and lavender soap. Claire closed the door with trembling fingers, then leaned against it for a moment as though bracing herself. "What did you find?" she asked. Moreau studied her. "Before I answer, tell me what you didn't say before. The truth, not the fragments, not the pieces softened by fear." Claire's throat tightened visibly. She walked toward the small table near the window, pressing her palms against its edge. "I tried to forget," she said softly. "For 20 years, I told myself I'd forgotten. But memory isn't something one chooses to keep or discard. It returns when it wants, carrying everything with it." Moreau remained silent, letting the moment stretch without pressure. Slowly, Claire lifted her eyes to his. "You asked about the ledger," she began. Yes, Valin kept one. I saw it once. Just once. He made no attempt to hide it from me. He said he wanted me to understand how the town functioned, how everything, every agreement, every favor, every lie, created a balance. He called it an economy of silence. Her voice trembled but did not break. Names were listed there. People from the town, the prefecture, even a few from Paris. Next to each name was something they had done, or something they owed. Moreau's breath caught. Owed to whom? To Valin, or to what Valin represented? She wrapped her arms around herself. At first I thought it was merely his arrogance, but then he showed me an entry. My name. He said I owed him something too. Anger burned softly in Moreau, controlled, coiled. What did he think you owed? Claire closed her eyes. Loyalty, silence, those were the debts he valued most. And what else? Claire hesitated. When she spoke again, her voice was barely more than a whisper. He wanted me to work for him, to help him find opportunities, to be his eyes inside the notary's office. He said I had a talent for listening, for recognizing what others wished to hide. Moreau felt ice settle along his spine. And when you refused? I didn't refuse, Claire said, opening her eyes again. I hesitated, and that was enough. Valin didn't tolerate hesitation. Moreau stepped closer. Is that why you left the town? Her silence spoke before she did. Yes, she said at last. I left because I feared what he would make me become. I took some documents, copies, not originals, from the notary's office, papers that contradicted certain entries in his ledger, proof that Valin had falsified debts or fabricated leverage. Moreau inhaled sharply. You took evidence. I took hope, Claire corrected. Hope that if I disappeared, Valin's influence would weaken, that the town would be free. But it didn't weaken, Moreau said quietly. It seeped deeper. Claire nodded, tears glistening. I never told anyone. I never used what I had taken. I hid the documents in Paris, in a place only I know, but Valin discovered I had them. Or suspected. He sent someone to ask questions. Gentle at first, then not. Moreau's pulse hammered in his ears. Claire, what did you see in Paris? Who did you see? She swallowed hard. A man in a fine coat, well-groomed, well-spoken. He said he worked for someone in government, that they wished to clean up old matters. He asked me to hand over what belonged to Valin. And you refused? I told him I didn't know what he was talking about, but he didn't believe me. He said it was better for everyone if the past stayed buried. That certain names should never be spoken again. She paused. The next day, I saw Valin. Moreau felt the room constrict. He's working with them. Or they with him, Claire whispered. A heavy silence fell. Outside, a bell rang distantly, muffled by fog. Moreau leaned against the wall, the truth settling around him like winter frost. Valin was not merely a manipulator who had returned to toy with Claire. He was part of a network, quiet, entrenched, and powerful, reaching into Parisian offices where men wrote policies by daylight and erased sins by night. He spoke softly. Claire, those documents you took. Do you know where they are? Yes, her voice trembled. And they're safe. Are they safe from Valin? She hesitated. Moreau understood. We need them. Now. Claire stepped back, her breath shallow. If I bring them forward, they'll come after me. After you. After anyone who knows. They already have, Moreau said. And they will again, but without those documents, we're fighting shadows with empty hands. Claire looked at him. Fear, strength, exhaustion, and a flicker of hope blending across her face. If I give them to you, what then? Then, Moreau said, voice low but certain, the past will demand to be heard. She bowed her head, nodding slowly. Tomorrow, at dawn. Moreau exhaled, tension releasing like a knot undone. He took her hand, just for an instant, not with affection, but with solidarity, with a quiet promise forged between two people standing against a storm. But before he could speak again, a sharp rap sounded at the door. Claire stiffened. Moreau moved silently toward the wall, positioning himself where the door opening would not reveal him. Another knock. Not tentative, not polite. Someone knew Claire was here. Someone who hadn't come for conversation. Moreau gestured for her to stay silent. The knock came again, 3 steady taps, too confident, too familiar. Claire's lips parted in terror. That's exactly how Valin knocks. But Moreau's blood ran colder still, because he recognized it too. Not Valin. Not one of the thugs from the mill, not the man from Saint-Malo. This was a knock he had heard often, delivered with practiced authority. The kind used by men from the prefecture. The kind used by those who held power. "Inspector Moreau," a voice called through the door, calm as a blade dipped in warm water. "We need a word." Moreau whispered to Claire, "Stay behind me." The past was no longer returning. It had arrived, and it had found their door. The voice on the other side of the door carried the kind of composure that made the hairs on Moreau's arms lift. Not loud, not forceful, merely assured, as though the speaker already expected obedience. Claire pressed herself against the wall, her breath shallow, eyes fixed on the door with a terror that bordered on paralysis. Moreau lifted a hand, signaling her to remain silent, then stepped toward the peephole with careful, controlled movements. He looked through it only briefly, but it was enough. Standing in the dim corridor was a man in a tailored coat, his hat held politely in his hands. His posture was the sort that came only from years spent navigating official buildings and political drawing rooms, a posture that wore authority like a finely brushed overcoat. Moreau did not recognize the face, but he recognized the type. A courier of high-level instructions, a man who delivered messages others were too cautious to put in writing. He opened the door only as wide as necessary, blocking the view into the room with his body. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone neutral. The man smiled without warmth. "Inspector Moreau, thank you for receiving me." His voice held the faintest trace of Parisian polish, the kind that slipped easily into a senator's salon or a backroom gathering of administrators watching their own shadows. "My name is Durand. I'm with the prefecture." Moreau kept his expression steady. The prefecture usually communicates through official channels. Durand's smile tightened. "Some matters are too delicate for paper. I believe we share a concern regarding a woman named Claire Rousseau." A cold pulse moved through Moreau's chest. "What of her?" Durand tilted his head slightly. "There are individuals who fear she may unintentionally disrupt certain long-settled arrangements. They would prefer she be persuaded to avoid unnecessary disclosures." "She is a witness," Moreau said, choosing his words carefully. "If she carries information relevant to past misconduct, it should be reviewed properly." Durand's eyes flickered with amusement. "Properly. An admirable ideal, Inspector. But the past is not a ledger in which one can simply add or subtract entries. Some matters have been resolved in ways that ensured stability. Digging them up again would only create disorder." Moreau stepped outside the room, closing the door behind him with deliberate gentleness so Claire would not hear more than necessary. The corridor was empty aside from the two of them, the silence nearly intimate in its threat. "Let me be direct," Moreau said. "Is Valin working with you?" Durand's expression did not change. If anything, he seemed faintly entertained. "Monsieur Valin is acquainted with men who value continuity. He performed certain services in the past, services that helped maintain the balance between local governance and administrative efficiency. Nothing improper, of course. But in these times, one must be vigilant. A single misunderstanding can ignite a scandal." "And Claire Rousseau is a misunderstanding?" Moreau asked quietly. Durand's gaze sharpened. She is a loose thread, Inspector, and loose threads unravel garments. Those garments protect men far more influential than either of us. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Footsteps sounded somewhere downstairs, soft, domestic, harmless, which only amplified the tension between them. Durand slipped a hand into his coat and withdrew a folded telegram. He offered it to Moreau. "This is merely a reminder," he said. "A request for discretion from the top." Moreau unfolded it. The message was brief, typed in clipped official language. "Maintain distance from the Saint Malo matter. Classified interest. Oversight engagement unnecessary." A seal marked the bottom, one used only in the highest tier of administrative correspondence. "This isn't a request," Moreau said. "It's an order." Durand inclined his head. "Call it what you wish. But you have a respectable career, Inspector. A life here, a wife, a reputation anchored in prudence. It would be unfortunate to jeopardize that over the recollections of a distressed woman." Moreau felt a tightening behind his ribs, a slow, rising flame. "Is that why Valin returned? Because he knows you will protect him?" Durand gave a soft sigh. "Valin is not the concern. He is merely inconvenient. What matters are the names tied to him, names that do not appear in any file because files can be seized, burned, or rewritten. But the ledger Claire Rousseau supposedly carries, that is the danger. Some men cannot afford their names to fall into the wrong hands." "And I am one of the wrong hands," Moreau said. Durand didn't deny it. "We prefer stability, as I believe do you." Moreau looked him squarely in the eyes. "If you know about the ledger, then you know why Claire can't simply disappear again." Durand shrugged lightly. "Disappear is a strong word." "It is the one you intend," Moreau said. Durand's voice softened to a coaxing whisper. "Inspector, you are respected. Walk away. Let this fade as it once did." Moreau felt something calcify inside him, a resolve he had not felt in years. "I'm not the same man I was then." Durand studied him for a long, cold moment. Then his smile evaporated. "Then I regret to say you have become an obstacle." He reached for his hat, slid it onto his head, and stepped back. "But obstacles can be managed. Good evening, Inspector." He walked down the corridor with a calmness that made Moreau's skin crawl. When Durand descended the staircase, Moreau waited until the last echo faded before re-entering Claire's room. She looked at him with wide, terrified eyes. "Who was it?" "Someone who believes silence is preferable to truth," Moreau said. He closed the door firmly. "Claire, you must tell me where the documents are. Now." She hesitated, and then the hesitation broke. "In the City Records Archive," she whispered, "on the Rue des Minimes. There is an old storage room that hasn't been used in years. I worked there briefly when I first arrived in Paris. I hid the papers behind the wooden panels near the second shelf." Moreau nodded. "We go tonight." Claire's eyes widened. "Tonight? But they'll be watching." "They already are," Moreau said, "which means waiting will only tighten the net." She wrung her hands, but her voice found a thin cord of resolve. "Then we go." Moreau watched her gather herself, a fragile woman who had spent 2 decades running from a man who had shaped her nightmares, yet now stood ready to walk toward danger with nothing but trust anchoring her steps. He felt a swell of quiet respect, not pity. Respect. They left the hotel through the back courtyard, slipping into the narrow alley where the fog lay thick and unmoving, like breath held by the city. Paris at night carried a different rhythm, quieter, watchful, listening. They walked without speaking, Moreau guiding Claire along the less-traveled streets, avoiding lamplight when possible. Each sound seemed amplified, the clatter of a carriage wheel, the distant bark of a dog the tap of footsteps they could not always place. As they approached Rue des Minimes, the fog grew heavier still. The old city records building rose ahead, sturdy stone walls, tall windows dimmed by decades of dust. Moreau tested the side door. It creaked open reluctantly. Inside, the air was stale, tinged with mildew and old ink. Their footsteps echoed too sharply, so they moved slowly, deliberate as ghosts navigating familiar paths. Claire led him to the narrow storage room. Cobwebs stretched between the shelves like neglected veils. "There," Claire whispered, pointing to a wooden panel near the back. Moreau crouched, pulling the panel loose. Behind it, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a bundle of documents tied with string. His breath tightened. They had what Valin wanted, what the prefecture feared, what Durand had threatened them over. "Let's go," he whispered. But as they turned toward the door, a faint sound drifted through the building. Footsteps, soft, controlled. 2 sets. Moreau extinguished his lantern. The darkness closed around them. Claire gripped his coat, trembling. Voices murmured in the corridor, men searching. Then a third voice joined them. Smooth, calm, unhurried. "Valine." "Find them," Valine said quietly. "We must have the documents before dawn." The footsteps split, one pair moving toward the east wing, another toward the front, and Valine's closer now, approaching the storage room. Moreau pulled Claire into the shadow of a tall cabinet, pressing her gently behind him. The documents lay tight against his chest, the knot of string cutting faintly into his fingers. Valine's silhouette appeared in the doorway, framed by the faint glow of a lantern held at his side. He stepped inside, scanning the shelves. He seemed almost relaxed, as though this search was a polite after-dinner errand rather than the culmination of a 20-year hunt. He moved closer. Closer still. Then he paused. His head tilted slightly. He smiled. "Henri," he murmured softly into the darkness. "Come now. We both know hiding is beneath you." Moreau said nothing. Valin chuckled. "If it eases your conscience, know that none of this concerns you. Give me Claire, give me the documents, and you may return to your respectable life. You can even pretend you never saw me." Claire's grip tightened around Moreau's coat. Moreau stepped forward, just enough to shield her fully. "No," he said. Valin sighed. "Predictable. Very well." He lifted his lantern slightly, and the light found them. But at that exact moment, a shout echoed from the front of the building. One of Valin's men called his name urgently. Valin turned his head, irritation flashing. "Handle it!" In that split second, Moreau seized Claire's arm. "Run!" They bolted past Valin, slipping under his arm before he could grasp her wrist. The hallway outside was narrow. They dashed toward the back exit, feet pounding against the stone. The shouts behind them grew louder, closer. Moreau forced the back door open, and the two of them spilled into the night air. The fog enveloped them instantly, hiding them in its cold embrace. Down the alley. Through a narrow passage, across a deserted courtyard. The city seemed to breathe in sync with their footsteps, guiding them not by sight, but by instinct. When they finally reached a small bridge over the dark canal, Claire stumbled, collapsing to her knees. Moreau knelt beside her, clutching the documents to his chest as he watched the fog-thick water flow beneath them. "Henri," Claire whispered, her voice shaking. "What do we do now?" Moreau looked at the documents, then at the water, then toward the city, where shadows moved like restless memories. "We don't run anymore," he said softly. "We expose them." Claire's breath caught. "All of them?" "All of them." Behind them, somewhere in the labyrinth of streets, Valine's voice echoed faintly. Calm, patient, unyielding. And as Moreau helped Claire to her feet, he felt a shift deep within himself. A line crossed, a decision sealed. Paris watched silently from behind its fog. The river flowed, carrying whispers of the past toward dawn. And the truth, at last, had begun its slow, unstoppable rise.